He thought his empire was unshakable, until one woman's secret threatened to bring it all crashing down. Greetings, my family. I'm your brother, Mr. Harrington. May the Almighty bless every mother and father here, protect every child, and heal every broken home. Each story I share is my offering of love and strength. You are my family, and I stand with you. If you stand with me, write present. If your love is real, write I am with Mr. Harrington. Make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next powerful story we share. I put a lot of effort into researching, editing, and the production of these cinematic stories. So please support me by subscribing, like, and share this video, so together we can reach more beautiful minds like yours. Tonight's story will shake you to your core. It's about one night that changed everything. One secret that could destroy an empire. And one woman who had to choose between love and survival. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. Others are meant to set us free. But what happens when the truth you're hiding could either save you or destroy everything you've built? What happens when one moment of weakness becomes the foundation for the greatest love story ever told? This is a tale of power and vulnerability. Of wealth and poverty. Of a single night that changed two lives forever, and the secret that grew from that moment. A secret so powerful it could bring down one of the most feared men in America. Alexander Drake. A name whispered in boardrooms and feared on Wall Street. A man who built his empire with steel and ice, who trusted no one and loved even less. For 34 years, he had lived behind walls of glass and stone, untouchable, unreachable, unbreakable. But even the strongest fortresses have cracks. And sometimes, it takes just one person to find them. But before we begin, let me ask you this. What would you do if one night of passion left you with a secret that could either destroy you or set you free? Her name was Aaliyah Carter. 27 years old, with almond brown eyes that held stories of struggle and skin that glowed like warm honey under the harsh fluorescent lights of a luxury hotel where she worked. She had learned long ago to make herself invisible in spaces where wealth whispered and power commanded respect. But sometimes, even the most careful invisibility isn't enough to escape fate. For 14 hours that December night, she had been on her feet, managing chaos, cleaning up other people's messes, watching from the shadows as guests dripped in diamonds complained about thread counts and champagne temperatures. The Meridian Grand wasn't just any hotel. It was where Manhattan's elite came to feel untouchable, where million-dollar deals were sealed with handshakes over 30-year-old scotch, where Aaliyah had perfected the art of being seen but not noticed. The storm had arrived without warning, turning the city into a frozen wasteland of abandoned cars and darkened windows. One by one, the airports shut down. One by one, the highways became impassable rivers of ice and snow. And one by one, every room in the Meridian Grand filled with stranded travelers who had nowhere else to go. Aaliyah's shift should have ended at 8. By midnight, she was still coordinating emergency accommodations, still smiling politely while entitled guests demanded miracles she couldn't perform. Her feet ached in shoes that had seen too many double shifts. Her head pounded from the endless stream of complaints and demands. All she wanted was a bed, any bed, just for a few hours of sleep before the morning brought fresh chaos. But when she finally dragged herself to the front desk, exhaustion weighing on her shoulders like a heavy coat, the news hit her like a physical blow. No rooms. Not a single vacancy in the entire building. The storm had trapped everyone inside, and there was nowhere for her to go. She stood there for a moment, swaying slightly on her feet, trying to process what this meant. The trains weren't running. The buses had stopped hours ago. Her tiny studio apartment in Queens might as well have been on another planet. She had exactly $43 in her checking account and no way to afford another hotel, even if one had been available. The night manager, Marcus, watched her with sympathetic eyes. He had worked alongside Aaliyah for 3 years, had seen her pull double shifts when her grandmother was sick, had watched her quietly slip her own dinner to a homeless woman outside the hotel's back entrance more than once. He knew she had nowhere to go. But there was only one room left. The penthouse suite. Already occupied by the most dangerous man in the building. Alexander Drake had arrived that afternoon in a convoy of black SUVs, his security detail sweeping through the lobby like a force of nature. The penthouse had been reserved for him for the entire week while he conducted business meetings that could shift entire economies. He was the kind of man who didn't share spaces, who valued privacy above almost everything else, who had built his entire life around controlling his environment completely. Marcus hesitated for a long moment, his finger hovering over the phone that would connect him directly to the penthouse. One call could solve Aaliyah's problem, but it could also cost him his job. Alexander Drake wasn't known for his flexibility or his patience with unexpected complications. Finally, necessity won over fear. The call was made. The situation was explained. And after what felt like an eternity of silence, Alexander Drake's voice came through the phone, cold and clipped and utterly indifferent to anyone's comfort but his own. "Just for one night," he said. "Until the storm passes. Nothing more." Alexander Drake. Even his name carried weight in rooms where power was currency and influence was oxygen. 34 years old and already the CEO of Drake Enterprises, a multinational empire built on steel, shipping, and generations of old money that stretched back to the robber barons of the 19th century. When he walked into a boardroom, conversation stopped not out of respect, but out of fear. When he spoke, markets moved and fortunes changed hands with the casual indifference of a man playing chess with people's lives. He stood 6 feet 3 inches tall, with ice-blue eyes that could freeze a man's ambition with a single glance and a jawline that looked like it had been carved from marble by a sculptor who understood the geometry of intimidation. His broad shoulders carried the weight of billions in assets, thousands of employees whose livelihoods depended on his decisions, and the crushing expectations of a family dynasty that had never known failure. Women chased him with a desperation that bordered on pathological. Supermodels threw themselves at his feet at charity galas. Socialites orchestrated elaborate schemes just to catch his attention for a moment. But Alexander Drake had learned early that everyone wanted something from him: his money, his influence, his name, his connections. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford, and love was a weakness that could be exploited by enemies who saw vulnerability as opportunity. He lived surrounded by glass and steel, in penthouses that touched the clouds and offices that looked down on the world like a god surveying his domain. His homes were museums of wealth and power, filled with art that most people would only see in textbooks and furniture that cost more than most people's yearly salaries. But despite all the luxury, despite all the comfort that money could buy, Alexander Drake slept alone every night. He ate alone. He woke up alone. He had built an empire, but he had no one to share it with. Until that storm brought Aaliyah Carter to his door. The elevator ride to the penthouse felt like ascending into another world. Aaliyah had cleaned these rooms before, had walked through them with her head down and her hands busy, invisible to the guests who inhabited them. But she had never been invited to stay, had never crossed the threshold from servant to guest, and the transformation felt surreal and terrifying. The penthouse suite occupied the entire top floor of the hotel, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Manhattan's glittering skyline. On any other night, the view would have been breathtaking. Tonight, it looked like the end of the world, a white void where the city disappeared into swirling snow and howling wind. Alexander was standing by those windows when she entered, his silhouette dark against the storm outside. He didn't turn to acknowledge her arrival, didn't offer any greeting or explanation. He simply stood there, as still and imposing as a statue, while Aaliyah hovered near the door with her small overnight bag clutched in her hands like a shield. The silence stretched between them, heavy with awkwardness and uncertainty. This was Alexander Drake's private sanctuary, his retreat from the world, and she was an intruder whose presence had been forced upon him by circumstances neither of them could control. She wanted to apologize, to explain, to somehow make the situation less uncomfortable for both of them. But the words stuck in her throat, strangled by the weight of his indifference. Just for one night, the hotel manager had said. Until the storm passes. One bed. One impossible, awkward situation. Two strangers forced together by fate, thrown into an intimacy that neither had chosen and both resented. At first, there was only silence. Alexander continued his vigil by the window, watching the storm tear through the city like a living thing. Aaliyah perched on the edge of the sofa, trying to make herself as small and unobtrusive as possible, checking her phone for updates on the weather that never seemed to improve. The tension in the room was almost unbearable, thick enough to cut with a knife. But as the hours ticked by, as the storm showed no signs of weakening, as the absurdity of their situation became impossible to ignore, something began to shift. Alexander finally turned from the window, his ice-blue eyes taking in the woman who sat so carefully on the edge of his space. And for the first time in years, he saw someone who wanted nothing from him except a place to sleep. The conversation started slowly, carefully. Neutral topics. Safe ground. The storm. The city. The strange way that weather could bring the most powerful metropolis in the world to its knees. But gradually, as the whiskey Alexander poured began to warm them both, as the late hour stripped away their usual defenses, the conversation deepened. Aaliyah found herself talking about her grandmother, who had raised her in a tiny apartment in Queens and taught her that dignity wasn't something that could be bought or sold. About her dreams of opening her own event planning business, of creating beautiful moments for people who deserved to feel special. About the loneliness of working in a world where you are always serving others but never truly seen. Alexander, for his part, spoke about things he had never told anyone. About the crushing weight of expectations that had been placed on his shoulders since birth. About the isolation that came with power, the way people changed around you when they knew what you were worth. About his father, who had built the Drake empire with ruthless efficiency but had never told his son he was proud of him. About the way success could feel like a prison when you had no one to share it with. The whiskey burned away the walls between them, loosened tongues that had been trained to guard their secrets. Laughter began to punctuate their conversation, genuine and surprised, as if neither of them had expected to find humor in their situation. Stories slipped past midnight, intimate revelations that should have stayed buried but somehow felt safe in the bubble of the storm-trapped penthouse. She told herself nothing would happen. This was Alexander Drake, a man so far above her station that they might as well have lived on different planets. He was powerful, wealthy, dangerous. She was nobody, invisible, forgettable. When the storm passed, she would return to her life of quiet invisibility, and he would forget she had ever existed. He told himself she was just another woman, no different from the countless others who had tried to capture his interest over the years. She would want something from him eventually. They all did. Money, connections, access to his world. She was pretty enough, intelligent enough, but ultimately disposable like all the rest. But as the night wore on, as their guards continued to fall, as their hearts began to speak louder than their minds, both of their carefully constructed defenses crumbled. The attraction that had been simmering beneath the surface of their conversation finally broke free, undeniable and overwhelming. When Alexander reached for her, she didn't pull away. When she kissed him back, he forgot every reason why this was a mistake. One night became a memory that would haunt them both. One night of passion that shattered every rule they had built their lives around. One night that would change everything, though neither of them understood the full implications of what they had done. When morning came, the storm had passed, leaving behind a city covered in pristine snow that glittered like diamonds in the weak winter sunlight. The spell was broken. Reality came crashing back, and the awkwardness returned with a vengeance. They dressed in silence, avoiding each other's eyes, trying to pretend that the night had been nothing more than a momentary lapse in judgment. Alexander left first, disappearing into his world of boardrooms and billion-dollar decisions without a backward glance. Aaliyah returned to her life of quiet service, cleaning up other people's messes and trying to convince herself that what had happened between them had been nothing more than a beautiful dream. But some dreams refused to stay buried. 10 months later, Aaliyah stood in front of her bathroom mirror in her tiny studio apartment, her hands trembling as her newborn son cooed in his crib nearby. The morning light streamed through her single window, illuminating a scene that would have looked ordinary to anyone else but felt like the most important moment of her life. She had been avoiding this mirror for days, afraid of what she would see reflected back at her. But now, with her son finally sleeping peacefully, she couldn't put it off any longer. She needed to face the truth that had been growing inside her for months, the secret that had transformed her body and her life and her future in ways she was only beginning to understand. Those eyes. Ice blue, just like his father's, staring up at her with an intelligence that seemed impossible in someone so young. That strong jawline, already visible even in the soft features of infancy. The resemblance was undeniable, unmistakable, terrifying in its clarity. Her baby was Alexander Drake's son. She had tried to hide it from herself for as long as possible. During the early months of pregnancy, she had told herself that the father could have been anyone, that the timing was just coincidence, that her child would look like her family and carry no trace of that one night in the penthouse. But babies don't lie, and genetics don't negotiate. The truth was written in every feature of her son's face. She had told no one, not even her best friend Sarah, who had noticed her growing belly and asked gentle questions that Aaliyah deflected with vague stories about a brief relationship that hadn't worked out. She had told no one about the night of the storm, about the man who would father her child, about the secret that grew heavier with each passing day. She thought she could keep it buried forever. She thought she could raise her son in quiet anonymity, love him and protect him, and give him the best life she could manage on her event coordinator's salary. She thought she could build a wall around their small family that would keep the outside world from ever discovering the truth. But in a city where wealth and power magnified every whisper, where information was currency and secrets were weapons, nothing stayed hidden for long. Already, she had noticed the way some of her co-workers looked at her son when she brought him to the hotel's employee daycare. Already, she had seen the questions in their eyes, the calculations they were making about timing and possibilities. And if the staff at a luxury hotel were beginning to piece together the truth, how long would it be before someone with real power and real resources started asking the same questions? But someone was watching. Someone who had been waiting, plotting, ready to destroy everything Aaliyah had built. Someone who had noticed the timing, who had seen the resemblance, who understood exactly what it meant. Someone who had been circling like a predator, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Someone who would stop at nothing to claim Alexander Drake's empire, and who saw Aaliyah's secret as the key to everything she had ever wanted. Family, I need to ask you something before we continue. Would you have trusted them at this point? Would you have told Alexander the truth, knowing it could destroy your life? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Her name was Veronica Steele, and she was the most dangerous woman in New York's elite circles. At 31, she moved through Manhattan's high society like a predator stalking prey, her platinum blonde hair always perfectly styled, her designer gowns always impeccably chosen, her smile always razor-sharp and calculated. She had been born into old money, the kind of generational wealth that whispered instead of shouting, but she had learned early that being born rich wasn't enough. You had to fight to keep it, to grow it, to wield it like a weapon. Veronica had first met Alexander Drake at a charity auction 3 years earlier, and from that moment, she had set her sights on him with the focused intensity of a hunter tracking the ultimate prize. He wasn't just wealthy, he was powerful. He wasn't just handsome, he was untouchable. He wasn't just successful, he was legendary. And Veronica Steele had decided that he would be hers. For 2 years, she had played the perfect girlfriend. She had attended his corporate events with grace and poise. She had charmed his business associates and impressed his board members. She had transformed herself into exactly what she believed a Drake wife should be: elegant, sophisticated, utterly devoted to his success and his empire. When he had finally proposed to her at a private dinner overlooking Central Park, she had felt like she had won the ultimate game. But Alexander Drake was not a man who could be easily conquered, even by someone as determined as Veronica. The engagement had lasted 8 months, during which she had thrown herself into planning what would have been the wedding of the century. She had booked the most exclusive venues, hired the most sought-after designers, invited everyone who mattered in their rarefied world. The wedding was supposed to seal her place in the Drake dynasty forever. Instead, Alexander had called it off 3 weeks before the ceremony. No explanation. No apology. No discussion. Just a cold clinical conversation in his penthouse office where he had told her that he couldn't go through with it, that marriage wasn't what he wanted, that she deserved someone who could love her the way she deserved to be loved. The words had been gentle, but the dismissal had been absolute. Veronica had left that office with her pride shattered and her carefully laid plans in ruins. But she had not left defeated. If anything, Alexander's rejection had only intensified her obsession. She began to see his resistance not as a final answer, but as a challenge to be overcome. She convinced herself that he was simply afraid of commitment, that he needed time to realize what he was giving up, that eventually he would come back to her. She had remained close to the Drake family, maintaining friendships with Alexander's cousins and business associates, attending the same charity events and social gatherings, always present at the periphery of his life like a ghost he couldn't quite exorcise. She told herself she was being patient, strategic, waiting for the right moment to remind him of what they had shared. But Veronica wasn't just obsessed with Alexander, She was obsessed with everything he represented. His fortune, his name, his legacy, the empire that bore his family's name and would someday need an heir to carry it forward. She had spent 2 years positioning herself as the natural choice for that role, and she wasn't about to let anyone threaten the future she had planned for herself. Which was why, when she first noticed Aaliyah Carter at a charity gala 6 months earlier, every instinct she possessed had gone on high alert. It wasn't just that Aaliyah was beautiful. Manhattan was full of beautiful women. It wasn't just that she was young. Veronica had seen plenty of younger women try and fail to catch Alexander's attention. It was something else, something in the way Alexander's eyes had lingered on her for just a moment too long when he thought no one was watching. Something in the way he had seemed almost startled when their eyes had met across the ballroom, as if he were seeing a ghost. And then there was the baby. Veronica had noticed him immediately, a beautiful child with features that made her heart stop and her mind race. Those eyes. Ice blue, unmistakable, carrying the genetic signature that every member of the Drake family shared. She had seen those same eyes staring back at her from family portraits in Alexander's penthouse, from board meeting photos in Forbes magazine, from Alexander's own face every time he looked at her with that cold, calculating stare. For months, she had watched Aaliyah from the shadows of charity events and corporate gatherings, her suspicion growing sharper with each sighting. She had studied the timeline, calculated the dates, observed the way Aaliyah seemed to avoid any situation where she might come into direct contact with Alexander. The pieces of the puzzle were all there, waiting to be assembled by someone smart enough to see the pattern. Veronica was certainly smart enough. She hired the best private investigators money could buy, the kind of professionals who specialized in digging up secrets that powerful people preferred to keep buried. She gave them Aaliyah's name, her address, her employment history, and one simple instruction: find out everything there is to know about her and her child. The investigators worked with the methodical precision of surgeons, dissecting Aaliyah's life layer by layer. They tracked her movements, monitored her communications, followed her home from work in expensive cars with tinted windows. They dug through hospital records and birth certificates, traced financial transactions and employment records, built a comprehensive profile of a woman who had tried very hard to live beneath the radar. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together with devastating clarity. The dates matched perfectly. The timeline aligned with precision that left no room for doubt. Aaliyah Carter had given birth exactly 10 months after the winter storm that had trapped Manhattan and forced the hotel to make unusual accommodation arrangements for stranded guests. But it was the DNA evidence that sealed the case beyond any reasonable doubt. A discarded coffee cup from Aaliyah's favorite cafe, sent to a laboratory that specialized in genetic analysis. The results came back with mathematical certainty. The child she carried shared genetic markers with the Drake family bloodline. Veronica held the report in her hands for a long time, reading and rereading the clinical language that proved what her instincts had already told her. Alexander Drake had a son. A son he didn't know about, carried and raised in secret by a woman who had somehow managed to slip beneath his radar and into his life for one unguarded moment. But Veronica didn't want to simply expose the truth. That would be too easy, too crude, too lacking in the sophisticated revenge she believed Alexander deserved for rejecting her. She wanted to use this information strategically, to control it like a chess master moving pieces across a board. She wanted to destroy Aaliyah Carter completely and position herself as the solution to the crisis that would inevitably follow. Because if Alexander had a son, he would need a wife to help him raise that child properly. He would need someone from his own world, someone who understood the responsibilities that came with the Drake name, someone who could navigate the treacherous waters of high society with grace and skill. Someone exactly like Veronica Steele. All she had to do was eliminate the competition. Meanwhile, Aaliyah was fighting a war within her own heart that threatened to tear her apart with every passing day. The secret she carried felt like a living thing inside her chest, growing heavier and more impossible to bear as her son grew older and his resemblance to his father became more undeniable. Every morning, she would wake up and look at little Marcus sleeping in his crib, and the sight would fill her with a mixture of overwhelming love and paralyzing fear. He was perfect, beautiful, the most precious thing that had ever happened to her. But he was also walking, breathing proof of a night she had tried to convince herself had been nothing more than a dream. She had created an entire mythology around that night to help herself cope with the reality of what had happened. She told herself it had been a moment of mutual loneliness, two strangers finding comfort in each other during a storm. She told herself that Alexander had probably forgotten her completely, that she had been just another woman in a life filled with beautiful, forgettable encounters. She told herself that what they had shared had been physical attraction and nothing more, that the connection she remembered feeling between them had been a product of whiskey and vulnerability and the strange intimacy that came with being trapped together. But every time she looked at her son, every time she saw Alexander's eyes staring back at her from that tiny face, she was forced to confront the possibility that what had happened between them had been something more significant than she wanted to admit. Part of her longed to tell Alexander everything. The fantasy would creep into her mind during quiet moments, imagining herself walking into his office, placing Marcus in his arms, watching his face transform as he realized he was holding his son. She would picture him embracing them both, declaring his love, whisking them away to a life of security and happiness where she would never again have to worry about making rent or buying groceries or whether she could afford to take Marcus to the doctor when he was sick. The longing was so powerful it sometimes took her breath away. She would find herself researching Alexander online, reading articles about his business successes, studying photographs of him at various events, searching his face for some sign that he remembered their night together, that he sometimes thought about her the way she thought about him. But the rational part of her mind always reasserted itself eventually, reminding her of the risks that came with revealing the truth. Alexander was powerful, but he was also dangerous. He was a man who controlled everything in his environment, who trusted no one, who had built his entire life around maintaining absolute authority over his personal and professional relationships. If she told him about Marcus, what guarantee did she have that he would react with anything other than suspicion and anger? What if he accused her of trying to trap him, of using their child to extract money or status or access to his world? What if he decided that she was just another woman trying to manipulate him, and responded by using his vast resources to destroy her? Worse still, what if he believed her but decided he wanted custody of his son? The Drake family had unlimited financial resources, teams of the best lawyers money could buy, political connections that reached into every level of government. What chance would a hotel event coordinator from Queens have in a custody battle against a billion-dollar empire? She could lose Marcus. The thought haunted her every waking moment, filling her dreams with nightmares where she watched helplessly as her son was taken away by people in expensive suits who promised him a better life than she could ever provide. She could lose the only family she had, the only person who had ever depended on her completely, the only love that had ever been hers without conditions or expectations. The fear was paralyzing, but it was also motivating. She threw herself into being the best mother she could possibly be, working extra shifts to save money for Marcus's future, reading every parenting book she could find, taking him to every free activity and program available in their neighborhood. She was determined to prove to herself, if not to anyone else, that she could give her son everything he needed without help from his father. But the isolation was crushing. She couldn't confide in her friends because the truth was too dangerous to share. She couldn't seek advice from her family because they would ask questions she couldn't answer. She was raising Alexander Drake's son in complete secrecy, carrying the weight of that responsibility entirely alone. And all the while, she could feel eyes watching her, shadows following her, a presence at the edge of her consciousness that made her constantly look over her shoulder and question whether the paranoia was real or just a product of her guilt and fear. Veronica began her psychological warfare with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a spider spinning a web. She understood that direct confrontation would be too risky. Aaliyah could simply deny everything, disappear with her son, or worse, run straight to Alexander with her version of events before Veronica was ready to control the narrative. Instead, she chose to terrorize her target slowly, methodically, with a campaign of intimidation designed to break down Aaliyah's defenses and leave her vulnerable to whatever final blow Veronica decided to deliver. The gifts started arriving at Aaliyah's apartment on a Tuesday morning in March. She found the package outside her door when she left for work, an expensive box wrapped in silver paper with no return address, no delivery confirmation, no indication of who had sent it or how they had gotten past the building's security system. Inside was a collection of baby clothes, each piece more expensive than anything Aaliyah could afford on her salary. Tiny cashmere sweaters that cost more than her monthly grocery budget. Silk rompers with designer labels she recognized from the windows of Madison Avenue boutiques. A miniature tuxedo that looked like it belonged on a red carpet rather than in a queen's apartment. There was no note, no explanation, no indication of the sender's identity. But the message was clear enough. Someone knew about Marcus, someone with enough money to buy clothes that cost more than most people's car payments, someone who wanted Aaliyah to know that they were watching. She threw the clothes away immediately, stuffing them into a garbage bag with shaking hands and carrying them to the dumpster behind her building as if they were contaminated. But the damage was done. Her sense of security, already fragile, cracked a little more. The next package arrived a week later. This time it was toys, not the simple practical toys she bought for Marcus at the discount store, but elaborate, handcrafted pieces that belonged in a museum. A wooden rocking horse that probably cost more than her monthly rent. Building blocks made from exotic wood and inlaid with precious metals. A teddy bear so luxurious it seemed almost obscene. Again, no note. Again, no explanation. Again, the terrifying implication that someone was watching her son, studying his needs, making judgments about the kind of life he deserved. The third package was the most terrifying of all. It arrived at her workplace, delivered directly to the hotel's employee break room where her coworkers could see it, could ask questions, could speculate about who might be sending expensive gifts to the quiet event coordinator who usually kept to herself. Inside this box was a trust fund application, partially filled out with Marcus's name and birth date, along with account information for a financial institution that specialized in managing wealth for New York's elite families. The dollar amounts referenced in the paperwork made Aaliyah's head spin. More money than she had ever imagined existed, earmarked for her son's education and future. The message was crystal clear. I know who your son really is. I know what he's worth. And I can ruin your life whenever I choose. Aaliyah's carefully constructed world began to crumble under the weight of this psychological assault. She couldn't eat without wondering if someone was watching her in restaurants. She couldn't sleep without starting at every sound in the hallway outside her apartment. Every knock at the door sent her heart racing. Every phone call made her hands shake. Every stranger's glance felt like a threat. She started taking different routes to and from work, changing her patterns randomly to make herself harder to follow. She avoided the employee daycare at the hotel, making expensive arrangements for private childcare that ate into her already tight budget. She stopped going to her usual grocery store, her usual coffee shop, her usual playground with Marcus, trying to disappear into the anonymity of the city. But no matter what she did, no matter how careful she was, she could feel the invisible presence watching her, studying her, planning something that she couldn't predict or prevent. The paranoia became a constant companion, coloring every moment of her day with fear and uncertainty. Her coworkers began to notice the change in her behavior. She had always been quiet, reserved, professional, but now she seemed jumpy, distracted, constantly looking over her shoulder as if expecting trouble. She made mistakes she had never made before, forgot details she would normally remember, snapped at colleagues who tried to offer help or friendship. Sarah, her closest friend at the hotel, cornered her in the break room one afternoon with concern written all over her face. She wanted to know what was wrong, whether Aaliyah needed help, whether there was something she could do to support her friend through whatever crisis was consuming her life. But how could Aaliyah explain that she was being stalked by someone who knew the most dangerous secret she had ever kept? How could she admit that her son was the child of one of the most powerful men in the world, and that someone was using that information to terrorize her? How could she ask for help when asking for help might expose the very truth she was trying so desperately to protect? So she lied. She made excuses. She brushed off her friends' concerns with vague explanations about stress and exhaustion and the ordinary challenges of being a single mother. She pushed away the one person who might have been able to help her, because she was too afraid to trust anyone with the truth that was slowly destroying her life. The isolation became unbearable. She was raising Alexander Drake's son in a prison of her own making, surrounded by secrets and lies and the constant fear that everything she loved could be taken away from her at any moment. And then, fate decided to force her hand in the most dramatic way possible. The invitation arrived on expensive cardstock, embossed with gold lettering that announced the annual charity gala hosted by the Meridian Grand Hotel, the same hotel where she worked, the same hotel where she had first met Alexander Drake on that storm-filled night that had changed everything. As the hotel's senior event coordinator, Aaliyah was expected to attend. It wasn't optional, wasn't something she could avoid without risking her job. The gala was the hotel's most important social event of the year, bringing together Manhattan's elite to raise money for children's charities while showcasing the hotel's luxury and exclusivity. Alexander would be there. She knew that with absolute certainty, because Drake Enterprises was one of the event's major sponsors, and Alexander never missed an opportunity to represent his company at high-profile charitable functions. He would be in the same ballroom where she would be working, separated by the invisible but impermeable barrier between server and guest, employee and patron. Veronica would be there too. As a member of New York's social elite and a regular attendee at charity functions, her presence was virtually guaranteed. She would be dressed in designer gowns, dripping in jewelry, moving through the crowd with the confidence of someone who belonged in that rarefied world. And Aaliyah, carrying her son because she couldn't afford a babysitter for the evening, would walk straight into the lion's den where the two most dangerous people in her life would be waiting. She considered calling in sick, making some excuse to avoid the event entirely. But she had already used too much sick time dealing with the stress and paranoia of recent weeks, and she couldn't afford to lose her job. She was trapped by her own circumstances, forced to face a confrontation she wasn't prepared for. But she had no idea that the moment she stepped into that ballroom, everything would change forever. The secret she had guarded so carefully, the truth she had sacrificed everything to protect, was about to explode in the most public way imaginable. Family, let me ask you this. Do you believe love can survive this kind of betrayal? When secrets this big come to light, can trust ever be rebuilt? Share your thoughts below. The charity gala was in full swing when Aaliyah finally gathered the courage to enter the ballroom. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across polished marble floors that reflected the light like mirrors of liquid gold. The elite of New York mingled in their natural habitat, women draped in designer gowns that cost more than most people's annual salaries, men in perfectly tailored tuxedos discussing deals that could reshape entire industries with the casual indifference of gods playing with mortals' lives. The air was thick with a scent of expensive perfume and champagne, punctuated by the soft melody of a string quartet positioned discreetly in one corner. Waiters moved through the crowd like ghosts, carrying trays of delicacies that had been flown in from around the world for this single evening. This was wealth in its purest form, power displaying itself without shame or apology. Aaliyah stood at the entrance for a moment, her heart hammering against her ribs as she adjusted Marcus in her arms. She had borrowed the silk dress from Sarah, a deep midnight blue that complemented her skin tone and made her look like she belonged in this rarefied world. Her hair was swept up in an elegant chignon, and she had spent more money than she could afford on makeup that transformed her from invisible hotel employee into someone who could command attention. But it was Marcus who truly transformed her appearance. Dressed in a tiny white suit that she had found at a consignment shop, he looked like a miniature prince, his ice-blue eyes bright with curiosity as he took in the glittering spectacle around them. Together, they looked like they belonged here, like they were part of this world of privilege and power instead of interlopers who had stumbled in from the outside. She wasn't the invisible event coordinator anymore. Tonight, she looked like she belonged. As she made her way deeper into the ballroom, weaving between clusters of conversation and laughter, Aaliyah tried to focus on her responsibilities for the evening. She was here to work, to ensure that every detail of the event ran smoothly, to solve problems before they became crises. But her eyes kept scanning the crowd, searching for the one face she both longed to see and desperately hoped to avoid. And then, across the crowded room, their eyes met. Alexander was standing near the bar, surrounded by a group of business associates who hung on his every word like disciples listening to gospel. He was wearing a black tuxedo that had been tailored to perfection, his ice-blue eyes sharp and alert as he navigated the complex social dynamics that governed events like this. He looked exactly as she remembered him from that night 10 months ago, powerful, commanding, utterly in control of his environment. Until he saw her. The world stopped. The music seemed to dim to a whisper. The crowd blurred into an indistinct backdrop of color and movement. All Alexander could see was the woman from that storm-filled night, the woman who had haunted his dreams and occupied his thoughts more often than he cared to admit. She was more beautiful than he remembered, radiant in silk that hugged her curves like liquid starlight, her almond brown eyes meeting his across the distance with an intensity that took his breath away. And in her arms, she carried a child with his eyes. The recognition hit him like a physical blow. Those ice-blue eyes staring back at him were his own, reflected in a face too young to understand the magnitude of what was happening. The strong jawline, the determined set of the mouth, The way the baby held his head with unconscious arrogance. Every feature screamed Drake family genetics with undeniable clarity. Alexander's mind raced, calculating dates and possibilities with the ruthless efficiency that had made him a billionaire. 10 months since the storm. 10 months since the night he had broken every rule he had ever made for himself. 10 months since he had allowed himself to be vulnerable with a woman whose name he had tried to forget but never could. The conversation around him faded to meaningless noise as he stared across the ballroom at the secret that could change everything. His son. The heir he had never expected, carried by the woman he had never stopped thinking about, living a life he had known nothing about until this moment. But someone else was watching the unfolding drama with predatory satisfaction. Veronica Steele had positioned herself strategically across the room, her champagne glass forgotten in her hand as she observed the moment she had orchestrated with such careful precision. She had waited months for this confrontation, planned every detail of this revelation, and now she was about to reap the rewards of her patience. She had expected Alexander to look shocked, confused, perhaps even angry when he realized the truth about Aaliyah's son. What she hadn't expected was the way his face transformed when he saw them together. The cold mask he wore in public cracked for just a moment, revealing something raw and vulnerable and achingly human underneath. It was an expression Veronica had never seen on his face during their 2 years together. It was wonder. It was longing. It was love in its purest, most unguarded form. And in that moment, Veronica realized that her carefully constructed plan was about to backfire spectacularly. But she had come too far to back down now. She had invested too much time and energy in this moment to let it slip away without achieving her objectives. If she couldn't have Alexander's love, she could at least have her revenge on the woman who had somehow claimed what Veronica had never been able to touch. She began moving through the crowd with the fluid grace of a predator closing in for the kill. Her designer gown whispered against the marble floor as she navigated between clusters of guests, her smile sharp and beautiful and deadly. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind dozens of times, planned exactly what she would say and how she would say it to achieve maximum impact. Alexander was still staring at Aaliyah when Veronica appeared at his side, her voice cutting through the ballroom chatter like a blade dipped in honey and poison. "Alexander, darling," she said, her tone perfectly pitched to carry just far enough to catch the attention of nearby guests without seeming like she was making a deliberate scene. "Have you met the mother of your son?" The words hit the assembled crowd like lightning striking a powder keg. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned to stare. The soft murmur of polite social interaction gave way to the electric silence that preceded scandal. Everyone in the immediate vicinity suddenly understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that would be whispered about in Manhattan's elite circles for months to come. Alexander's associates looked between him and Aaliyah with expressions of shock and confusion. The woman standing beside him, whom they recognized as his former fiancée, had just detonated a bomb in the middle of New York's social event of the year. And from the look on Alexander's face, the accusation wasn't being denied. Aaliyah felt her world shatter into a million irreparable pieces. Her secret, the truth she had guarded with her life, was now public knowledge proclaimed in front of the city's most powerful and influential people. The carefully constructed walls she had built around her small family had just been demolished with a single sentence, leaving her exposed and vulnerable in front of an audience that would judge her without mercy. She held Marcus closer to her chest, her maternal instinct screaming at her to run, to get her son away from the predators who were already circling with barely concealed hunger for gossip and scandal. Tears streamed down her face, not just from embarrassment but from the crushing realization that everything she had tried to protect was now lost. The guests around them were no longer pretending not to stare. Cell phones appeared in manicured hands, ready to capture whatever drama was about to unfold for social media posterity. The whispers began immediately, spreading through the crowd like wildfire as people tried to process what they had just witnessed. Is that really Alexander Drake's child? How long has this been going on? Who is she? Did you know about this? The questions multiplied and spread, each one adding to the suffocating weight of public scrutiny that was about to crush everything Aaliyah had built for herself and her son. But Alexander didn't run. He didn't deny the accusation. He didn't rage at Veronica for exposing what she had no right to reveal. Instead, he began walking slowly across the ballroom, his ice-blue eyes locked on his son's matching gaze with laser-like intensity. The crowd parted before him like water, guests stepping back to create a path between the billionaire CEO and the woman who carried his secret. Every step he took was measured, deliberate, carrying the weight of a decision that would change the course of multiple lives. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how one of the most powerful men in America would respond to having his private life exposed in such a public and humiliating way. When he reached Aaliyah, he stopped just arm's length away from her. For a long moment that felt like an eternity, he simply stared at the child who was undeniably his own flesh and blood. Marcus stared back with the fearless curiosity of innocence, reaching one tiny hand toward the stranger who shared his eyes and his stubborn chin. Then, slowly, gently, Alexander reached out and touched his son's tiny fingers with his own. The contact was electric, a connection that transcended words or explanations or the complicated circumstances that had brought them to this moment. In that instant, every wall Alexander had built around his heart crumbled into dust. "What's his name?" he whispered, his voice so soft that only Aaliyah could hear him above the crowd's expectant silence. "Marcus," Aaliyah replied, her voice breaking with emotion. "Marcus Alexander Carter." The middle name hit Alexander like a revelation. She had given their son his name, even when she believed he would never know about the child's existence. Even when she had every reason to hate him for abandoning her, even when she had been facing the terrifying prospect of single motherhood with no support from anyone, she had honored him by giving their son his name. Alexander smiled then, really smiled, for the first time in years. Not the cold, calculated expression he wore in boardrooms or the polite mask he donned for social events, but a genuine smile that transformed his entire face and made him look 10 years younger. "He has your strength," he said softly, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "And my stubborn streak." The comment drew nervous laughter from some of the guests, but Alexander ignored them completely. His attention was focused entirely on the woman and child in front of him, on the family he had never known he wanted but now couldn't imagine living without. Veronica watched her carefully orchestrated plan collapse in real time. She had expected anger, denial, rejection. She had counted on Alexander's notorious distrust of women and his pathological need for control to turn him against Aaliyah and the child who represented everything he feared about vulnerability and commitment. Instead, she was witnessing something she had never experienced herself during their 2 years together: unconditional love. The expression on Alexander's face as he looked at his son and the woman who had borne him in secret was everything Veronica had tried desperately to inspire in him and had never succeeded in achieving. It was the look of a man who had just discovered what he had been searching for his entire life without knowing it. Alexander turned slowly to face the woman who had tried to destroy his family before it had even had a chance to begin. When his ice-blue eyes met Veronica's, she saw something in them that made her blood freeze in her veins. This wasn't the cold indifference she was used to seeing from him. This was something far more dangerous, the protective fury of a man who would do anything to defend the people he loved. His voice, when he spoke, was steel wrapped in ice, carrying the kind of quiet menace that had made him feared in business circles around the world. "Veronica," he said, each word precisely articulated and loaded with meaning. "You wanted to expose my secrets? Here's one more: I never loved you. But I love them. And if you ever threaten my family again, you'll discover what happens when you cross a Drake." The threat hung in the air like a sword suspended over Veronica's head. Everyone in the ballroom understood that they had just witnessed not just a public rejection, but a declaration of war. Alexander Drake had just chosen his side, and it wasn't the side anyone had expected him to choose. Veronica's face went white, then red, as the full implications of her defeat sank in. She had gambled everything on this moment, had believed that exposing Aaliyah's secret would drive Alexander away and leave her position to pick up the pieces of his shattered trust. Instead, she had inadvertently given him the greatest gift of his life while simultaneously making herself his enemy forever. The crowd around them was buzzing with excited whispers, cell phone cameras capturing every moment of the drama for posterity. By morning, the story would be all over the tabloids and social media, dissected and analyzed by people who thought they understood the dynamics of wealth and power, but had never witnessed love triumph over calculation in such a dramatic fashion. But Alexander didn't care about the publicity or the scandal or the gossip that would inevitably follow. He was looking at Aaliyah, at the woman who had kept his son safe and loved and protected for 10 months while he lived in ignorance of their existence. He was thinking about all the moments he had missed, All the nights she had walked the floor alone with a crying baby, all the fears and struggles and small victories that he should have shared with them. "I'm sorry," he said, the words barely audible but heavy with meaning. "I should have found you. I should have known. I should have been there." Aaliyah shook her head, tears still streaming down her face, but no longer from fear or shame. These were tears of relief, of hope, of the overwhelming realization that her worst nightmare had just transformed into her most impossible dream. "You're here now," she whispered. "That's all that matters." 6 months later, Aaliyah Carter became Aaliyah Drake in a private ceremony held in the penthouse where their love story had begun. The wedding was small, intimate, attended by only their closest friends and family members. There were no reporters, no photographers, no crowds of curious onlookers. Just two people who had found each other in the storm and decided to build a life together, witnessed by the people who mattered most to them. Alexander didn't just accept his son. He embraced fatherhood with the same intensity and dedication he brought to everything else in his life. He learned to change diapers, to prepare bottles, to sing lullabies in his deep voice that made Marcus giggle with delight. He attended every pediatrician appointment, every milestone moment, every small victory and setback that marked his son's development. Marcus took his first steps in the same penthouse where his parents had first found each other, his tiny hands reaching for his father while his mother cheered from across the room. It was a moment of perfect symmetry, a completion of the circle that had begun on a storm-filled night when two strangers had been thrown together by fate. Every night, instead of sleeping alone in his glass and steel fortress, Alexander held his wife and son close, grateful for the storm that had brought them together and the secret that had ultimately set them all free. He had spent 34 years building walls around his heart, and it had taken a single night and a hidden child to show him what he had been missing. The penthouse that had once felt like a beautiful prison now felt like a home. The silence that had once oppressed him was now filled with laughter and conversation, and the sounds of a family learning to love each other. The isolation that had protected him from betrayal and disappointment had given way to the messy, complicated, absolutely perfect chaos of domestic life. Veronica Steele disappeared from their lives as completely as if she had never existed. Faced with the prospect of Alexander's unlimited resources turned against her, she quietly withdrew from New York's social scene and moved to Europe, where she spent her time trying to forget the spectacular failure of her revenge and the man who had chosen love over calculation when she had given him the chance. Because sometimes, the most beautiful love stories begin with the most unexpected nights. Sometimes, secrets aren't meant to destroy us, they're meant to set us free. Sometimes, the very thing we fear most turns out to be the key to everything we never knew we wanted. And sometimes, a winter storm can change the entire trajectory of two lives, creating a family from loneliness and transforming enemies into lovers with the simple power of truth spoken at exactly the right moment. Family, let me ask you one final question. Do you think they made the right choice in the end? Should love always triumph over fear? Or are some secrets too dangerous to share? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And remember, your brother Mr. Harrington will always be here to share these stories of love, redemption, and the power of truth. May your homes be filled with the kind of love that conquers all fear. May your secrets become sources of strength, not shame. And may you always have the courage to choose love over fear. If this story touched your heart, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. Share it with someone who needs to believe in love again. Until next time, this is your brother Mr. Harrington, reminding you that every ending is just a new beginning in disguise.